anyways, we're just gonna fly into this.
Yeah, might as well.
Would you like to introduce some information about yourself?
Not even. We can go straight into it. All I know is on the subject of what we're going to be discussing today. Hopefully, I know a decent bit about mysticism. I'd say Hermeticism, Esotericism, kind of the Kabbalah influences of that, a little bit of the Buddhist influences on that. And to be fair, honestly, the bulk of my knowledge just centers around the Golden Dawn. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a lot of different threads we
a
can
lot
take
of
to
stuff.
explore down there. Yeah.
Yeah, what are you feeling first, man?
I think we'll open up with mysticism.
Okay.
Because that's a good segue into...
Yeah. What do you think on that? What do you think on that?
Well, I mean, mysticism is obviously intimately tied to non-rational, intuitive ways of knowing, of being acquainted with reality. Reality understood as ultimately a mystery or something that is intrinsically beyond comprehension with concepts and rational ways of learning.
Yeah, I really agree with that. I think mysticism in itself is its own epistemology. Essentially, I completely agree with what you say. I think that it kind of perceives the universe as a kind of objective truth to be interacted with, not something that's necessarily knowable, but something that can be experienced, obviously, through mystical states. I'd say I think that really opens a lot more on like the discussion like mystical practices. I think as well. I think meditation, shamanistic ritual, these are all like very like key components of that spread thing. But yeah, you can also then narrow that scope, I think, to Hermeticism. I know, what have you read up on that so far?
I mean, I've been trying to learn a bit more about Hermeticism recently, just sort of sketching out on the history. So I'll be mostly like, I'm looking to like learn stuff from you about it.
Fair enough.
It seems, it's... Yeah, I mean, I would you like to introduce me?
For sure.
Introduce me, like, what your sort of thoughts on Hermeticism.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very I guess if you're trying to look at it from a historical perspective, it's a very shadowy thing. It's very hard to pinpoint where Hermeticism starts. I think you can quite easily pinpoint where its influence is modernly, but I'd say historically. Do you know Hermes Trismegistus?
Yeah, he's a central mythological figure.
Yeah. So within that, essentially what he does. I'm not going to say I'm an expert on all this or I've read all his text, but from what I've researched, what he does is mystically combine kind of esoteric practices from Christianity, ancient Egypt, and Greece, kind of. And that tradition has kind of spread through a long lineage of kind of direct ritualistic knowledge from there on. One of the most interesting ones for me is Rosicrucianism, if you know that.
What's that, Rosicrucianism?
Very weird stuff, but the Rosicrucians are basically a set of monasteries in Germany they were Christian monks, but actually they had really big incorporation of secret Hermetic teachings and ritual, a lot of it really dating from Hermes Trismegistus in a way. But within that, so if you look at the big influences, what that kind of comes down to, so you get Christianity. I think that's really interesting. So a lot of emphasis on the supreme, on monotheistic kind of deity in a way. But then the other really, really fundamental influence for me, and that's what I find maybe the most interesting, is Kabbalah, which in itself, doubles down on that kind of monotheistic kind of supreme, but it sees it almost as almost a kind of panpsychic way, in my experience, I'd say. But yeah, anyway, so what gets very interesting with these Rosicrucians is that ultimately, through a really weird lineage and kind of inspection of and translation of old Rosicrucian texts, all their teachings got integrated into Freemasonry.
Mm.
So we always talk about the Freemasons as like quite an occult sect. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And they definitely are. Yeah, they definitely have some very occult practices. But what I find quite interesting is that I find that quite misunderstood in that actually all their ritual stems directly from Rosicrucianism. It's literally like a Christian sect if you look at it, because it's Christianity combined with like old Jewish like mysticism.
What sort of rituals could we sort of like go into some of those?
Yeah, definitely. I was gonna say I think the easiest way to talk about that is through Golden Dawn,
Golden
because
Dawn,
that's what I probably know most about in terms of like ritualistic practice. Some really interesting stuff there.
Yeah, so I guess like
I can give you like a little intro
yeah
to them
for
if
like
you
the
want.
people as well, like
Yeah,
you know.
exactly. So the Golden Dawn. So basically, they were so they were part of the Freemasons. They were literally its own kind of separate guild within the Freemasons, operating out of the UK in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and they were constructed specifically with the task of what you'd probably term like occult science for these Freemasons. So they literally researched their rituals. They were the guys to do all this kind of Rosicrucian documentary kind of analysis. You know, really like they'd like translate kind of unique works of like Rosicrucian abbots themselves and then incorporate that into their kind of like overall Freemason ritual. But so what it means is that these guys were probably the ones to take it the furthest out of all Freemasons. But where it gets really interesting, I think where it gets very misunderstood as occultism is that, well, ultimately, if you look at their ritual practices, it's basically like Kabbalah X Buddhism for me. It really is. And the most kind of interesting figure within that tradition, the one to, in my mind, really take it furthest and show what the whole point of it is a guy called Aleister Crowley.
Crowley, yeah.
Yeah, classic figure. Honestly, very like culturally influential. You can literally see him on the cover of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. I think he's in like the top left somewhere, looking real creepy or some shit. I think very misunderstood character. I think he loved media attention, so he's literally vilified as like the devil himself in like puritanical like 1920s England.
Right, yeah, no.
But he definitely did some crazy shit. That's not.
Yeah, no. I mean, I remember well when I was reading a bit about Golden Dawn before and stuff like that. He was apparently I found he was sort of like quite a controversial kind of figure.
Very much so.
Like kind of disliked. There was sort of you know the sort of I mean the suggestion that he was sort of you know was suck up or who's the main character who was sort of the main founders of Golden Dawn. I'm trying.
Oof, I think that one of the big ones. So this was the guy that he kind of took over from was MacGregor Mathers.
MacGregor Mathers, yeah, that was the name.
So Mathers was one of the guys who was doing all this kind of early analysis of Rosicrucian documents.
Yeah.
A lot of the kind of Golden Dawn, like almost syllabus in a way, is coming from him. It's quite interesting when you say stuff like syllabus, because like it's quite culty behaviour in a way. But what I really enjoyed with researching a lot of this stuff, especially with Crowley himself, is that he says, of course, you have to kind of believe in a way for these things to have power, but at the same time, you can't be over. It's tricky to say, but like you can't try and over-explain a lot of these things either philosophically. So it's like if you meditate and you have a certain effect within yourself, yeah, religiously you can claim this is God who's done this or something like that. But at the same time, it's like, yeah, you can believe and use any aid to believe that works for you. So it's kind of an almost universalist practice. But at the same time, you really also do have to take it as these are specific psychological inputs that I'm putting into a process. They are also what I'm getting out of it. Like a lot of people in Golden Dawn were literally psychologists as side hustles. It really ties into kind of like Jungian psychology, especially. So archetypes, what kind of making the subconscious conscious. That's like a really big focus.
Yeah, and I think that's
of that stuff.
That's an interesting thing about when we're mapping the psyche, and obviously part of mapping the psyche is mapping, you know, elements of experience that are accessible to consciousness, and then elements of experiences that are, you know, postulated to be quote unquote deeper, more intuitively, less directly, immediately accessible. That's like the realm of the subconscious. You know, that's something that obviously
Absolutely.
is explored by sort of Jung and Freud with the psychodynamic tradition, and then Jung obviously was much more sympathetic to the spiritual side, I suppose. And Freud,
Jung was literally kind of accused of being an occultist, you know what I mean? And I think the link between the two is very strong, especially when you look at the Red Book.
Oh yeah, his
visions, crazy stuff.
Yeah,
he literally records visions of his kind of collective subconscious. And I think that the best way to really interpret a lot of Hermeticism is almost as kind of like Jungian psychology.
Interesting.
Because if you look at kind of ritual practice, of kind of mystical states, whether it's kind of Kundalini yoga, kind of shamanistic peyote rituals, ayahuasca ceremonies, anything on that level of mysticism, it always has to be done with a very specific intention. And I think within the case of something like Hermeticism, the ultimate intention is literally to like I say, make the subconscious conscious, develop the psyche, and ultimately for them it's like, it depends if you believe in this or not. I'm not one to say, and I'm not an expert, but like on like higher self or like inner self, for them a lot of their communication with that is just thinking like, okay, the inner self is literally like the most holy part of the self. It's the self that is essentially an extension of God for them, and coming into actual conversation with that part of yourself is a mystical experience. It's like the aim of mystical ritual, and they actually devise certain techniques to do that, which are like actually crazy. Like it's nuts what they did. But we can go into that a little bit if you want.
Yeah, no, yeah, definitely. But like, just as sort of a precursor.
Yeah, definitely.
It sounds like all these sort of different techniques, mystical techniques. It's the cultivation of sort of ways of sort of conversing, communicating with those sorts of it feels like deeper aspects of the self. Shamans, the idea within shamanism is that they're entering this sort of shamanic trance of ecstasy enables them to convene with, say, spirit entities. That was often the interpretation, and there is an interesting question of like how do we what interpretation do we make of our subconscious content? It's because some people will interpret it, say, oh, I feel like God is speaking to me, or someone more secularly inclined would be that it's just the subconscious contents of my organism's world building sort of. But it's like it's either interpretation we make. There is something inherently mysterious about the unconscious. And
our interaction with it, whatever that format is under, But no, I think where it gets very interesting is when you analyze like a lot of ritual in kind of a Jungian way. For me, a really good maybe introductory one, as a good example is what the Golden Dawn termed the ritual of the bornless. So it sounds like some pretty heavy stuff.
The bornless.
Yeah.
Interesting.
If I'm correct, it's been a while since I've read anything on this, but so the whole thing is that you enter a very strong trance. You meditate for about half an hour, 45 minutes. That's how long it takes to do. Probably longer if you want to do it that way as well. And what you literally call up is you visualize kind of entities from your collective subconscious, really foundational parts of ourselves, and they in almost kind of like fairy tale-ish way, they imagine them as like elementals. So
what do you mean by elementals?
So it almost like a kind of so I think, what is it? So I think there's like undines for water, gnomes for earth, I think sylphs for air, and salamanders for like fire or something like this.
Oh, okay.
So I think you could use anything. But the way that they do this ritual is they literally call upon these like elemental forces, give them a name and give them a shape, and literally visualize them. So what they're doing is they're giving focus to a deeper part of their subconscious,
Yeah, no, that sort of reminds me of as relating to sort of like Kabbalah and sort of these techniques of
Yeah.
convening with the transcendent, you know.
Absolutely.
It has obviously ties to sort of like magic, I suppose. Or
Yeah,
the
essentially.
use of magic, which is a sort of a ritual technique, obviously, to invoke, like you described,
Yeah.
these spiritual entities. if
These
you
are
want.
magical operations,
Yeah.
if you're going to call them that way.
And like maybe it's like the whole thing of like,
Mhm.
you know, yeah, magic's often a word that is sort of designated to put down or to be dismissive of
Yeah.
certain like activities and stuff like that. You know, people think of like magic as being less than or illusory or something, but it's like there is sort of, you know, in terms of like what we're talking about with these techniques of imagination
Yeah.
and the use of imagination in a particular manner, like. You know,
And like focusing on the subconscious, because after all, with all these rituals, it's not just about summoning something, it's about making it act a certain way. If you want to kind of rein in a part of your subconscious, that's how they do it. They say, oh, this kind of earthy part of myself, this kind of materialistic part might be out of whack. That needs correcting through kind of ritual, just repeated ritual. It's literally just that. But I think like you're saying with stuff like magic, the reason it gets put down so often is also just because people, I mean, I really hate seeing this stuff online sometimes, but like witch talk. Oh, I hate it, bro. It's because for me, when you talk about magic and stuff like this, you shouldn't. Well, it is manifestation. You know, that's all it really comes down to. It's making the external world around you change through changes to your internal world. You know, the inner reflects the outer, and it's just your lived experience of it. You know, you will see the world in a unique way. That's all there is to it. And by changing the way you see the world changes.
And that obviously ties into like Jung's concept of
Literally.
synchronicities and
Yeah.
how synchronicities, these sort of meaningful connections that
Yeah.
aren't immediately sort of you can't reason why they occur. Like it's. I mean, it's getting into synchronicity. I'm not going to go into all.
No,
of that
no,
just
for
yet.
sure. It's a box of worms.
But it is sort of you know, relating obviously to the relation of the inner and the outer, and how the conditions of our inner
Definitely.
predispose how we attentionally orient to the outer.
Yeah,
it's-
and that's why I really disagree with a lot of people like modern day on stuff like TikTok who do like magic for the sake of external reasons. That it's like someone would do like a money jar. It's like, oh, you put all your stuff in this. You like write a little bit of something, and you really focus on getting your money up or something like that. It's like, bro, get a job. Like, I'm sorry. Like, we can all make money. You don't need to do a ritual to get money. Like, the magic is going out there and doing it. But for me, it's like these techniques should it's not even that they only should. They only have worth if applied internally. You know, that's where the real business is at for me.
Yeah.
It's like if you're trying to kind of in a Nietzscheistic way have like a kind of Übermensch experience, that's what you have to undergo, in my opinion. You know, you're literally trying to philosophically, fundamentally rebuild yourself and like build yourself in a positive direction. You know, I think that these mystical experiences are very fundamental to that in a lifelong way. But obviously, there's different ways of going around it. I mean, I love anything Buddhist. Like, have you seen almost like ego killing Buddhist ritual or nah? Some of it is nuts.
Well, like, but like the yeah, no, I've definitely like it's Eastern philosophy was very much a segue and a rabbit hole for me to sort of to these deeper contemplations
Absolutely.
of mysticism, especially given like, I mean, when I was an early teenager, I went through a massive like atheistic, almost Richard Dawkins,
Yeah,
Sam
just
Harris
sort of like,
kind of phase,
yeah, I know
where
what you
it
mean.
was
I know
like
what you mean.
religion was sort of dogmatic and irrational, and science, but science is, you know, you can better explain this phenomenon as like, and during that period of the life, you know, it was sort of the taking, you know, the intellect or the reason and science as these sort of transcendent sort of thing, or like I found appreciation for the mystery of reality through sort of obviously contemplation of how science present like so that sort of but then that sort of attitude obviously made me neglect this sort of the spiritual sort of side, the contemplation of faith and religion and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I mean, gosh, I always remember like when I was like 16, I had to do like this sort of extended project for, you know, my thing. I did it on like the evolution of religion, you know, what
Yeah,
the religious mind, pretty
genealogy
much.
of morality.
And it's like, yeah, that, and but obviously because I was like sort of I had a prior sort of you know, assumption of being an atheist and stuff like that. Obviously, I didn't want to see religion as something.
Well, you just don't see it. If you're,
Yeah.
it's like what we're saying. It's like if you have an atheist assumption baked into your mind that you cannot unfix, like you're gonna see the world in an atheist way. There's not even an option for it to not be. You know.
Yeah.
Like reality is gonna be subjective that way. But
Yeah.
sorry, carry on, bro.
But like and like obviously like that atheistic outlook, you know, it made my sort of transition into more mystical ways of thinking all the more sort of arresting
Yeah.
and psychologically and intellectually sort of an intense experience. Like you know, there's a sort of a saying that I've heard
Yeah.
called how the intellect is often the bouncer of the heart, kind of.
Yeah.
And
I like that.
and
I like that.
I think it's from like this philosopher Bernardo Castrop, who he's got he's got a philosophy of like analytic idealism, whereas
Yeah.
which is like very interesting. I point people to explore
Yeah.
that, but that sort of the notion of like sort of the intellect being the bouncer of the heart, kind of as it relates to sort of my atheistic transition towards more mystical ways of thinking, very much came through exploring like psychedelic experiences and exploring the intrinsic limits of reason and, you know, thought to capture and approximate reality.
Yeah.
And there's also like the reason in terms of our scientific inquiry into nature, into quantum mechanics, and the contemplation of that.
Yeah. It only leads us so far, I guess.
That obviously leads to a sort of mystical kind of interpretation of reality, I find, like, and a lot of you know, it's you know, and I suppose sort of I feel now like I still have significant value for both science and mysticism, right? And I do not see them as things that we can fully, whilst we have different words for them, you know, it's like
they're intertwined.
you know, they're deeply sort of like intertwined, and yeah, it's
This builds really good into Kabbalah, by the way.
Yeah.
If you want me to explain how.
yeah, let's start it's built, let's go into Kabbalah. Talking about like rituals of
No, even just like with what you're saying about kind of avenues towards what you're basically saying, enlightenment. You can basically understand that really easily through Kabbalah's Tree of Life. Crazy thing that I mean, do you know how old it is? It's crazy.
Tell me.
It's something like 7,000-8,000 years old. It's ridiculous. It's crazy. I honestly, it's one of the first kind of Jewish philosophical traditions, like dating back to the tribes of Israel. This is like primordial spiritual knowledge, at least within our Western tradition. Like, if you really think about it, there's not that many religions that are even going to be anywhere near that old. Like Hinduism is really old, like 6,000-7,000, maybe more. I'm not going to be the expert on that. Buddhism, very old as well. But yeah, Kabbalah, very, very primordial stuff in my mind. But yeah, I'm not sure if anyone's too familiar with this stuff. But you have this kind of Tree of Life, they call it. It's just, honestly, it's a diagram, very funky diagram. It's got 10 spheres and 22 paths. And essentially what it represents, it's basically a conception of reality. It's almost like, the best way I've heard it described is like as a filing cabinet. You know, you can really trace all sorts of things onto it as a framework. So for them, you can, there's 10 spheres. They can be kind of 10 archetypal forces within psychology, for example. So imagination, victory, justice, these are all very fundamental things to how we think and feel and organize a society. At the same time, when Hermetics were like adopting Kabbalah, they literally would meditate on these kind of 10 forces as almost astral planes. You know, they would go visit these places in their mind. So it's quite crazy, but it basically stems down from Malkuth, which means the kingdom at the bottom. That is physical reality, and it goes all the way to Keter at the top. Yeah, we just got a diagram here, so I'm just trying to show around a little bit as well. So you have 3 pillars on it, left, center, and right. I think Boaz and Joachim are the name. Do not quote me on that. It's a lot of old Hebrew stuff, which I'm not very good at. But if you look at these 3 pillars, it kind of links back to what you were saying earlier. So they all kind of link from the journey between Malkuth to Keter. For a lot of Golden Dawn members, that's the ultimate intention of ritual, kind of ascending your psyche and your consciousness to kind of to incorporate all these different things, kind of properly, sufficiently, have them balanced, but notably in a journey towards Keter, so enlightenment in a way. Keter is essentially, it means oneness.
Yeah.
So it's divinity. It is God itself. It is everything. It is the one.
Yeah.
I am that I am.
Yeah, and I think there's an interesting dimension to this sort of spiritual inquiry, in the sense of how
It's very like systematic.
in terms of how we can systematize it into sort of techniques to cultivate for a deepened spiritual awareness.
Exactly.
But then there's also
they're all their techniques at the end of the day.
But there's also a side to spirituality in terms of how that the original mind is the Buddha mind, as it's said.
Yeah.
And
if you're going to think about it,
it's like, how you do not have to. Enlightenment is not something you do to. On some level, there's enlightenment is not something you do to get. It's a relinquishing of.
Yeah.
And it's a relinquishing, and this ties into ideas from like Taoism of Wu Wei, effortless action.
Literally, and I think kind of egoless state, and so a lot of their, if you're going to look at this whole kind of tree of life psychologically, a lot of what they do with ritual is literally kind of deconstruct their mind in order to attain basically balanced ego loss. Not even necessarily full time, but like kind of. For them, they see the ego as a useful part of the psyche. A lot of like Eastern philosophies will just actually try to do away with it completely. I say Buddhism is if you're going to think about ego death, it's a very strong proponent of it.
Yeah.
I think for a lot of these Western things, though, kind of Western Hermeticism, which nonetheless incorporated these ideas, for them it's a lot more of like the ego has its place. It has an everyday use. We can't, especially in the modern world, I think it's very tricky to be utterly disconnected.
Yeah, definitely.
The ego is useful, but the ego does have its place. The ego is not supreme.
Yeah.
There are higher powers that we answer to, whether moral, kind of epistemological, kind of metaphysical. There are things that exist beyond us, whatever we might think religiously.
Yeah, no, and I sort of see sort of the ego on some level being a sort of a basic constituent of being
Absolutely.
an organism, and an organism which is obviously subject to selective pressures and stuff like that, and in a certain level, whilst there is obviously like the distinction between the organism and the environment is a permeable one. But we can point to that boundary and say, whilst obviously it is at the deepest layer of reality, not actually there. Like when you sort of zoom out, and you see cells, it's like that. It's the whole thing of like when we talk about reality, and our thought splits it into stuff, and that can create the illusion of separation. And but then there is
the internal is the external.
But then there is a pragmatic thing, and I think that there is a meaningful distinction between the inside and the outside, and in terms of like feeling like an organism, and because I do not feel like I'm in this sort of almost a schizophrenic kind of flow where like my self self modeling is saying I am the chair or whatever, but it's like it's
an understanding of it. And that's
So
what I mean. I don't think that for a lot of these sorts of people who are practicing like very heavy ritualistic stuff, they're never aiming to kind of align themselves with Keter full time. Like that's something that a lot of people, in the same way that a Buddhist will believe that you only reach true enlightenment after you die. Like you cannot be enlightened and alive at the same time. It's the same thing as like Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. You know, you can be either alive, organistic, living, or you can be non-living, enlightened, part of the greater nirvana.
I mean, I think
Crossing both is possible, but it's a temporary experience.
Well, yeah,
a lot of people have experienced it. I mean, probably you, but
well, I mean, there's an interesting thing, like how sort of I can't remember which sort of where I read it from, but it was like there's a reference to people who undergo sort of this sort of this spiritual process of deconstructing the ego and stuff like that. Post that process, they're almost living dead in a certain way in terms of it's and there's a kind of contradiction kind of in that, and but
that's what I mean. So it's a very, I think it's a very hard thing to balance. But I was gonna say, going back to what we were saying earlier, with what you're saying about kind of like scientific and kind of esoteric knowledge in a way, if you look at this like tree of life again, so you have like 3 pillars, so you have different avenues to reach Keter, so enlightenment in a way, and so people saw this kind of so you have the pillar of severity, pillar of basically kind of esotericism was the middle pillar, and the pillar of kind of mercy on the right. So they say that kind of severity, so if you were to like take this path to enlightenment, what that means is kind of severe experience, you know. I think in a lot of way you can have people hit enlightenment, you know, at rock bottom. You know, that's what I mean, like absolute destruction of ego through experience. It's a horrible thing to happen, but it is a mystical thing as well.
That's sort of that's something. I mean, that reminds me a lot of some of the work I've been having to like think about recently from some of my essays, from the work of Simone Weil.
You're talking about this,
you know, her sort of because she was a mystic philosopher. And some of her,
good crossover.
Some of her ideas were about reality creation and stuff. Are very much inspired by Jewish mystical ideas. Like, for example, I mean, well, she didn't specifically sort of like read the text and stuff like that, but like from, you know, like she was. I mean, she wrote she read the Bhagavad Gita, which is very influenced by Eastern thought. I mean, it's But what I was going to say relating to sort of how spiritual enlightenment can come when people are rock bottom or totally sort of in it deep steps of suffering. She has this sort of concept of, you know, affliction or milieu as it's sort of the sort of
as a conduit, I guess.
As a conduit, but she described sort of affliction as this sort of capacity of the world to transform you know, a sort of an organism, a person, a soul, into a mere thing, kind of. And she calls this process force, almost. I mean, she talked a lot about force in this sort of she did this analysis of the Iliad, the poem of the Iliad, as a sort of a poem of force in terms of how you know, I mean, the Iliad is obviously sort of a story about, you know, the war and that sort of stuff, and it was and about this sort of the dynamics of, you know, in a war, you know, there's one individual who kills the other individual or whatever, but I'm waffling on through this, but it's but it's, and it's the question of like who is really in control of the action there, kind of, and like the person who is killed in a state of conflict, you know, or you know, it's just like they're. I'm trying to think of a better analogy to describe what force is. I say like force is this impersonal principle.
It's higher than us.
That sort of you know, it's very central. I mean, it's built into almost, I feel like, the aspect of reality in terms of how there is this feeling of necessity of raw mechanism.
Yeah, baseline.
And
physical baseline.
Yeah, and sort of natural laws which do not conform and change according to human sort of like wishes and stuff like that, or to organism risk it. Look at the number of like mass extinction events that have occurred on this planet, kind of. There's a sort of there's the capacity of the world to totally affront all the ego's defenses and the sense of security, of safety, with it can occur to anyone, and it's just sort of you are very much reduced to a thing, an object. She has like this quote where in states of affliction, the soul is marked with a kind of slavery, and it loses half the soul. I mean, speaking about it metaphorically, but it's like the mark of slavery is crucial, because it's this sort of feeling that you become simply a slave to the impersonal whims of reality, kind of. And sometimes, in a certain way, it's like, and that totally affronts someone's concept of the self, and it totally deconstructs the ego, and it sort of deconstructs the whole sense of being a discrete person. And it's like
it's an ego dissolving process.
It's an ego dissolving process, but perhaps like at the most extreme in terms of like total suffering. And but like I don't want to distract too much from
I mean,
Tree of Life, but
the converse of that is what I also thought you were saying with like kind of scientific reason. At a certain point we reach a kind of mystical limit where you're looking at like quantum physics and like particles so small we can't even understand them, on a lot of levels. Or if you're going to look about kind of like,
well, you zoom out,
like
dark matter,
it literally, and I think it really fits into this. It's a very Kabbalistic concept. It's repeated everywhere, as above, so below.
As above,
it's true scientifically. Quantum exists at the smallest and largest levels.
And it's sort of for me it speaks really to this almost fractal-like nature of observable reality, the sense of zooming in and out, and understanding that as organisms we are representing a sort of a relative medium scale, and that sort of and like necessarily as sort of like organisms, our sort of perceptual model has to concentrate and do this kind of data compression. If we were acquainted with everything going on, we would dissolve into just this entropic soup, kind of. So it's like and it's an interesting thing about in this sort of modelling that our organism does. It's intuitively, or it somehow has to realise the relevant aspects.
100%.
And this is an idea that that John Vervaeke, sort of a sort of cognitive scientist, philosopher, sort of talks about, like this sort of idea of relevance, realization. How given like the number of things that we can potentially orient to is combinatorially like infinite in theory. And so how do we discern the relevant features of reality?
Exactly. And I think when you really get down to it, I think that something like science is all like at its deepest level, as much as scientifics are cynics by nature, I think it all comes down to something quite mystical at the end of the day. There is a mystery that we are unable to solve at the end of the day, and probably we likely won't ever solve it. Same thing as kind of philosophical mystery, metaphysical mystery, So I think that's another like way to enlightenment, at least for these people. But if I'll wrap up on this whole tree stuff anyway, but just for the last bit, it's like, so you have like a left pillar severity experience, you have a right pillar of mercy, of kind of scientific rationale. But actually what these traditions say is like the easiest way to enlightenment is mystical, is spiritual, is a kind of combination of both. It's experiential and kind of, for them at least, scientific. You know, it's applied psychological techniques, you know. But I've definitely got some pretty crazy, like, secondhand stories that I read from, like, bibliographies of some of these people, if you want to hear some. But, like, the ritual aspect to it is very pushed.
Yeah,
it's very interesting.
I think we'll go into that in a moment.
Yeah, definitely.
But,
you got, like, any more questions on this before we depart?
Well, I just like having some, like, thoughts about, you know, the tree of knowledge in terms of, you know, an appreciation of these different pathways to enlightenment, you know, through mystical, non-rational knowing, but also obviously rational kind of forms of knowing in terms of science and stuff. And, like, I sort of I feel like I can conceive of you know, you know, this apparent separation between, you know, sort of general Eastern techniques, which if to broadly categorize them is sort of seeming to an inquiry into isness that turns inward in a sort of way. You know, I know there's certain like dualistic kind of assumptions built into the way we talk about it, kind of, but it's like it's an inquiry into the subject. But then you look at Western, you know, I mean, well, science is not exclusive to the West, but science as objective empirical verification is a kind of looking out and verifying with, you know, other observers as well. It's rather than a turning inwards, it's a turning outward kind of. And it's interesting how
ultimately it's the same mystery, you know.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, and it's interesting how going in these apparently opposite directions, you paradoxically reach to the same place.
Exactly.
And,
I mean, that's what you're saying. It's essentially these are false dualities, you know.
And it's like it's tied into like non-duality, which is a fuzzy kind of term.
Yeah, I love any Derrida, if you've read his stuff. I love some Derrida. He great 20th century philosopher, deconstruction, anti-binary in philosophical thinking. Great guy to read up on. Love him. But you got any more on this?
On the tree
like
of life.
Kabbalah and stuff like that. There's a lot of depth to this. I could literally do 2 hours just on it, literally just explaining step by step how you can interact with almost the tree of life. I mean, every level is associated with like entities, like angelic entities that you can reach through different ways. Well, supposedly. I'm not going to say I've actually done any of this stuff because, you can't tax your mind like that too often, I don't think. And so I'm not going to claim to be the expert on this stuff. But no, you can really, really carry on reading into it. It's a great rabbit hole. Very interesting stuff.
Yeah, no, and I think like it's definitely something like in terms of my own sort of like spiritual exploration is very much, you know, being in, you know, this time period where you have the internet and access to just an absurd wealth of information from diverse
100%.
sources, you know, from my initial sort of introduction to these sort of Kabbalistic ideas, like they do very much integrate with my own sort of like current like foundation of like interest in Jungian psychoanalysis, as well Eastern philosophy, mysticism in general, and I think and this is like to tie back to like an earlier point we sort of talk about with like the relationship between the spiritual framing of ego and how in Buddhism the ego is perhaps
maybe a bit more dispensable.
It is seen as more dispensable than I say in this sort of in Kabbalistic techniques where the ego is sort of there is more space given to, or there's more there's an appreciation of the machinations of this psychic complex, and I think especially when thinking about how do we sort of bring more spiritual or meditative awareness to the West, to individualist cultures, which are particularly cultures that, you know, just I feel like different cultures obviously have different sort of sets of ways of understanding the world and oneself and their relationship to the world. But I think there is a sort of there is a component in I feel like in individualist kind of cultures where you are more conditioned into feeling like a separate somebody. I mean, this is an idea like Ram Dass calls somebody training, and how from the moment we're born, there's that sort of process of conditioning to feeling like a discrete, that ego formation, and then obviously in that ego formation is almost like it's not looking at it as a negative process. It's almost a necessary kind of process.
I think the ego, well, when we really deep it, it's the psychological mechanism through which we experience. It is like our seat of consciousness as we know it, but no, that's what I mean. I think what you do with it ritualistically is ultimately always going to depend on how you actually conceive of it in the first place. Yeah, to be fair, this ties in really, really, really well into like Abramelin, if you know that.
Abramelin?
Abramelin, not Abramelin.
So a bit of information for others as well. Like,
no, for sure.
What is Abramelin?
Abramelin, So, yeah, it's a really interesting kind of ritual case study. I put it that way. I'm not going to say I believe in it necessarily for disclaimer purposes.
Fair.
Interesting for anyone to look into, I think. Vital stuff. I've only heard of anyone actually succeed of it like once. It's basically the most complex ritual performed, well, one of them basically by Golden Dawn initiates, and it aims, essentially its fundamental aim is a dissolution of the ego by a really crazy process, like forced ego dissolution through just meditation. Really hardcore stuff. Its origins comes in the 1600s. I think it was gonna have to remember here. I think it was a Czech preacher called Abraham. Went on a this is like all documented. It's really crazy stuff. He went on a pilgrimage to, I think, towards Egypt. I can't remember where exactly, but he met this sage called Abramelin, who literally lived out in the middle of nowhere, hadn't seen anyone in years, and literally just gave him his teachings. Classic like hermit stuff, like Hermeticism. And so he transferred him this ritual after like helping this guy get better after like 2 months of walking when he like landed on his doorstep. So he like cured this guy and he gave it to him, and this guy came back to Europe, performed this, got passed into the Rosicrucians, and eventually, like we said earlier, into kind of Freemasonry, Golden Dawn and all that, where Aleister Crowley undertook it. And it's, about the ritual itself then, it takes 18 months to do.
18 months?
18 months. It's 3 stages of 6 months of like rigorous meditation daily, and what you're doing in this meditation, you basically have to give yourself almost like an altar to pray at, every day, to meditate at, to invoke various kind of entities to help you along the way. Like, it's a very documented thing. It's really, really fucking hard, basically. And Aleister Crowley tried it 2-3 times. The first time he failed. So each time he was a bit of a beast. Like, for context, like he was good at this stuff. Like he was a master of meditation. He spent years learning yoga, incorporating that into hermetic techniques. He took the system as far as it could go, in my mind, and as far as anyone has successfully done so. I mean, success is a difficult definition in this context. But yeah, the first time he did it, he tried to do it in 6 months, quit after 2 months because it was not the right time, and the place that he did it is so haunted. He had like an old like Scottish castle.
Why did he do it? And did he find out it was haunted after meditating?
No. He made it haunted. Like, haunted, but no, because like the whole thing of this there's a lot of different ways through which you can understand it. One of them is literally like you're evoking demons. You know, some really occultist, like brutal stuff. So what it aims to do is like, if you want to conceptualize kind of angels and demons as a kind of Jungian archetype, you know, something that exists in all of us, like as a psychic force almost, but almost like empirically psychological, you know, wrath, envy, like the 7 deadly sins. These are all like observable, quite basic parts of human psychology, no matter what you say. But also things to kind of strive against, like running blocks. So what they do in this ritual, in a way, when you're meditating, you're literally summoning these things and then banishing them from your own soul to try and make yourself more pure in a way, you know. What I was saying earlier, you're literally visualizing a psychic force within yourself, which you're then expelling, you know, that you're putting restrictions on.
It reminds me of something I've heard about, the practice of lucid dreaming, or inducing lucid dreams for sort of therapeutic use.
Yeah.
I mean, there's obviously
it's imagination at the end of the day.
And as well, like, say people in a lucid dream, they could summon in their dream, you know, a sort of a manifestation of, you know, their shadow or their deepest fear or their deepest trauma, like a representation of it, and then the subconscious will produce something, you know, rather, and then there's that process of psychologically standing up, or psychologically giving space to that thing that we are sort of intuitively averse 100%. To, and makes us uncomfortable, kind of. That, you know, it's easier said than done, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I mean. It takes ages to do, and to a level where it's effective.
Especially when you're in this sort of this technique of Abramelin. It's
Abramelin.
I'm making sure I said it correctly.
No, exactly.
This whole meditative summoning of kind
of
entities of the subconscious, or the collective unconscious, rather. You know,
I think you could, like I say, I don't think you have to think of it very dogmatically. I think you can really analyze these rituals at a psychological level, and they make a lot of sense, and I find them very interesting for that. But so what ended up happening with this guy? So he tried it a couple of times. First time he failed, made his castle like ridiculously haunted. Weirdly enough, Jimmy Page owned it at one point.
Jimmy Page, guitarist.
Yeah, Led Zeppelin guitarist, for all our listeners. He literally sold it because he said it was so haunted. Like, this man loved his occultism, I'm not even gonna lie. Like, read up on the curse of Led Zeppelin, because he did some really crazy stuff. But yeah, it literally, he said it was like, it was too haunted for him. Sold it on, it burned down. Like, that's just like apparently, like, there's like old tales, like people going missing around there, like really fucked up shit. Jeez. And just because he just didn't complete it, he left it unfinished. He like opened something that like he didn't close, you know, psychically.
Ooh, well, that's
you're summoning some powerful forces, you know.
That's and like I certainly, I think like while sort of some people might turn those up at sort of the idea of these summoning powerful forces. What I would say is that, I mean, I intuitively find it plausible, and I intuitively from my own sort of contemplation, my own personal practice of meditation and shamanic techniques, I sort of do certainly feel, especially in a deep meditative state of absorption, of trance, that you are acquainting oneself with much more experientially intense things, presences, fields. So sometimes
there's loads of different ways of understanding it,
and
there's like DMT gremlins, I guess.
Yes, but machine elves, like light beings, and like this ties into sort of
they're just like observable features under certain circumstances,
and
basically.
And I feel like sort of the meditative trance
it's a much controlled way of doing it.
It can place one's consciousness in a state where it can become more sensitive, more receptive to the subtler aspects of reality that in a sort of conventional waking consciousness, we may be repressing, may be dissociated from. But I think dissociation in general is a very interesting aspect
field of experience.
In terms of dissociation.
Definitely.
I mean, and dissociation as sort of. I mean, this sort of ties into what I mentioned earlier about Bernardo Kastrup, his sort of his metaphysical stance of analytic idealism, sort of posits reality as like a one mind essentially. I mean, that's one way, and we are dissociated alters of that one mind kind of
universe looking at itself, I guess.
The universe experiencing itself from a multiplicity, or perhaps a multiplicity of dissociated alters or perceptions and stuff. But what was I tying on before about meditation, trance? This, I think you can become more sensitive to potentially these forces, these very powerful forces, demonic, angelic, or what you may call it. I do think a lot of people operate under the assumption that, say, humans are or the human mind or human intelligence is the pinnacle of the pinnacle of creation in terms of being agents who can manipulate reality. But I do find it very plausible to think that this ties into the question of aliens and what is or the concept of transcendent intelligences that
I just think that it's a very interesting, all these things are really interesting. I think at the end of the day, I'm always going to be a little skeptical with anything. I think you have to. I think we can say that we have certain experiences. I think we always have to be slightly skeptical because anything is as likely as anything else. That's the nature of our metaphysical mystery.
I appreciate the skepticism and it's obviously
I think you always have to take things at face value a little bit.
Yeah, I sort of assess one's evidence, obviously. But I do think in terms of this notion of intelligences in reality, I think the most plausible candidate of that is through contemplation of plant mind interactions with humans, and psilocybin, for example, or fungi. Fungi, obviously, very complex, especially when you delve into the mycelial network. And this, there's a whole side that I'd point people to Paul Stamets if they want to learn more about that.
And definitely some Terence McKenna too.
Yeah, Terence McKenna as well.
Classics.
And psilocybin, obviously. Converts to psilocin, which is a structural, very structural analog of serotonin. Very, very similar.
It's crazy. It's really crazy.
And same thing with DMT and tryptamine.
It's two methyl groups apart, I swear. But
the point I was sort of making is that DMT is something that is ubiquitous in nature and within animals, and
it's literally in our system.
And the notion that ingestion of it will produce these visionary mystical states, especially when you pass out 5-MeO-DMT and NM-dimethyltryptamine, which produce different kind of experiences. 5-MeO, often called the God molecule. I could tell you, but I'm not personally
acquainted.
I'm not personally acquainted with it, but from what I've read reports, it does produce very much a kind of a non-dual experience of interconnectedness.
For sure.
A white light.
Bro, it's literally Keter. If you look at it at this diagram, it literally says white light at the top, limitless light.
And that's crazy to contemplate that even for the most atheistically inclined, physicalist, sort of someone who's sort of averse to all this sort of spiritual
Exactly.
woo-woo.
There's still like
Smoke this plant, my friend.
yeah,
and
it's a transcendental thing.
it's and as another point, it's interesting the difference between like 5-MeO and NM-dimethyltryptamine. So like the NMDMT is the one often associated with these mystical visions of alternate realities.
Or like entities.
Yeah, and entity encounters and these presences, and it's like, and
it's just like it's a common factor. Like anyone can take it as long as they take enough. A lot of people will see just similar entities. It's crazy.
Yeah, the convergence. That's
either way. I was gonna say I don't have too long.
Yeah.
I probably need to.
I want to respect your time.
No. But I was gonna say if you want to quickly circle back, I can tell you how to what the actual like philosophical construct of an Abramelin is.
Yeah, let's go for that.
Yeah.
Abramelin.
Yeah. So I'll quickly rush through that because I'm aware that we probably don't have too much time.
That's all right. But we'll definitely be having a follow-up conversation.
Yeah, definitely. But just dipping back to what Crowley managed to do with this, the second time that he did it, so when you do this, just to say like how good he is at what he did, you're supposed to conduct this in almost a temple. You're supposed to have an altar, a lot of different kind of items that you're using for these ritualistic things as just aids, but so he actually did this whole thing while he was trekking from I think it's like the south of India through the south of China for about 6 months. He literally spent 6 months with his wife and a kid trekking across this like countryside on a donkey. Like it's quite dumb. Like he got really ill. Like you would. It's early 1900s. But he was so good. So he was doing this ritual the whole time without anyone realizing. The way he'd do it, he'd literally be on his donkey getting led and zone out. He would picture himself in a temple. He'd set up his temple perfectly in his mind. And then from there go into a second level of visualization. Because when you're in this temple, you have to use it. When you're doing it normally, I guess, you have to visualize entities. You have to do it a certain way, So he's literally on 2 levels of visualization. It's just the immense amount of meditative concentration.
That's interesting.
It takes a long time to get that good.
Yeah, and this sounds very similar to something that I've heard from this guy called Thomas Campbell, he's a physicist, but who's also very interested in out of body experiences and the research into that, and I'd point people to explore some of his work. It is quite interesting, particularly as he's interpreted as a physicist. He's interpreted stuff like the results of physics in terms of relating to a universe that is a kind of almost a conscious virtual reality, but and we are sort of these units of consciousness. But in tying to the sort of what you talked about, the visualization of one level, and then also another one that can occur in parallel. Yeah, like I think the parallel idea is significant.
It's just like all the while, if you really deep it, he was also like steering a donkey, bro. Like just that ability to to expand your consciousness to so many levels. I mean, this is after years of meditation and yoga, like very impressive stuff. But the way, so essentially, if you're trying to reach the goal of an Abramelin operation, you're trying to literally talk with your higher self. What that takes, if you're kind of reverse engineering that to look at that, what you need is to absolutely dissolve your ego. And I don't mean as in like a little DMT ego death that lasts a couple minutes. I mean like a literal 2-month long period of self-inflicted, essentially psychosis, an egoless state. So that's what they need. How do you achieve that? Okay, so the way to do it is actually through philosophy and logic. So what he did is he incorporated a lot of Buddhist koans, like mantras, so mantras on the nature of reality to focus on, for months at a time, like metaphysical inconsistencies that cause us to doubt the universe in itself, And so what you do if you're literally starting this operation is that you basically use these kind of mantras to dissolve all your currently held knowledge. You know, and then ultimately, if you want to like really reach a transcendental state, you actually have to abandon that logic in itself. If you use logic to destroy everything, well, and actually your logic itself is flawed. Like we've seen this in philosophy, logic is not a perfect system. You know, you have to give that up as well, and you literally kind of like surrender, let go, become, you know, in a Taoist sense. You know, you have to literally let go of your whole kind of psyche, its understanding of anything, and that is an egoless state. And no, he did that on a donkey for 6 months.
That's
like
fucking wild.
Yeah,
Jeez.
nutty.
And it's this whole process of enlightenment, almost, you know, phrased as a sort of giving up of everything. You know, it's a relinquishing of all identity structures,
Absolutely.
of all claims to, you know, understanding what's going on, like, or
it's so hard to explain in a podcast. That's what's quite funny. It's I mean, transcendental by nature. You can't. It's nothing. It is something. Yeah. At the end of the day, it can only be experienced.
But then experience as well is a word as well.
Exactly. There has to be a subject to experience, you know.
It's we can call it experience, and I think experience is a good pointer to it. Like saying the present moment, the eternal, timeless now, or these words. They can operate as pointers, but they're pointing to something that, you know, obviously can't be exhaustively talked about. It, you know, defies. It is void of any property that we could ever assign to it. But then it's like we are it in a deep sense. Yeah. And you don't need to go anywhere.
No, you
don't need to do anything.
Experience.
It's almost like if you want to frame it as an insight, which it isn't really. It's an insight that we miss. Not because it's so out there and far away and distant to us, but because it's so close, it's right in front of your nose, such that you miss it. You know, it's and like it's and I feel that it you know, in terms of how I despite my interest obviously in all these sort of mystical states and cultivating techniques to you know, reliably enter into these sort of like trance-like sort of states. I guess if there's anything that I have derived from that knowledge and from that process of exploration, other than obviously that, you know, the one thing I know is that I know nothing.
Yeah, exactly.
But there's also a part that is like,
well, there is something.
Yeah, very the whole process has made me very sensitive to
very intuitionist.
Very intuitionist, and also very sensitive to the nature, the sense that reality is a flowing flux, a kind of a process, and like what is primary is processes in reality rather than, you know, stable, discrete things, kind of. And I think this ties into sort of I'll point people to explore the work of like Alfred North Whitehead, a sort of a British mathematician and philosopher. It's a very interesting process. He's sort of often associated with process philosophy, which is I mean, he was like living obviously around a time where we were like quantum mechanics. There was a whole, you know, the difficulty of interpreting the results of that, and you know, Einstein obviously, you know, was quite dismissive. You know, had the famous "God does not play dice."
Yeah, he does not.
But
I was gonna say, man, I might actually have to head out if you want to wrap things up.
Yeah, no, but we've had
I think we've
absolutely
covered a
beautiful
lot of stuff.
Roundabout conversation. Like
I think it's
an hour and 9 minutes. But I
I
want to be respectful of your time. Obviously.
I wish I had a bit more, but it might need a follow up.
We definitely will. I think it's like
Yeah.
we've got a lot. I really enjoyed
Yeah.
this. I learned a lot as
If
well.
you want anything on Enochian stuff, that's some pretty wild stuff too.
Oh god.
Yeah, a little intro to whatever
But
next.
yeah, I mean, obviously, you would. Would you like to like remain like more like anonymous for this?
For now.
For now, yeah. Because obviously, that's a lot of the stuff we've talked about is quite, you know, in certain sensitive, stuff that may, but obviously be immediately.
And like I say, I'm not. I wouldn't, as a disclaimer, like I'm not necessarily like a proponent of whatever. I just find it really interesting to research. I think everyone kind of should be at least open to receiving new ideas. But
Exactly.
yeah, no, that's all I really have to offer for now.
No, well, it's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you for
Yeah,
hosting.
no, thank you very much for joining me. This will be hopefully the first of many more like conversations.
We'll see.
You know, I'm bored of my own sort of voice. So it's like talking to other people gives me such an opportunity to learn so much more and expand.
It's always useful. Yeah, and I've learned so much. Thank you, man.
Yeah, no, and I like being able to riff ideas as well off each other. It's like
philosophy is a taught process. You know?
Yeah, it's a beautiful thing. But thank you very
much.
much.
Love that. All right,
I shall sign off there. We go. Adios, peeps. Enjoy. Bye bye.